The train thundered through the night, its wheels slicing through the darkness like a blade. Inside the lavish compartments, passengers whispered in hushed tones, their laughter laced with secrets. And then, just as the clock struck midnight, a single chilling sound echoed through the corridors. A wine glass shattering, a body hitting the floor, a final strangled breath. Murder had found its way aboard the Orient Line Express, and before the night was over, the killer would strike again. The thick veil of fog clung to Ceresi Station, winding like silent phantoms around iron columns, curling through the dim gaslights that barely cut the morning gloom. The Orient Line Express loomed on the tracks, its polished brass glinting faintly under the station's flickering lamps. Detective Agatha Marple stood alone, her coat drawn tight against the dawn chill, eyes sharp beneath the brim of her modest hat. The air smelled of damp coal and departure, a scent that carried both promise and unease. Something in the atmosphere crackled, not just the hum of early travelers, but the quiet electricity of trouble. She stepped onto the train, her footsteps a dull echo on the plush carpet as she made her way down the corridor, her gaze flicking over the narrow compartments, the polished brass handles, the reflections that warped and shifted in the curved windows. Her cabin was compact, tidy, functional, not indulgent. To any casual observer, she was a historian on a modest research trip, a woman of books and archives, but beneath that unassuming exterior lay the mind of a hunter. She adjusted her hat in the oval mirror, catching a sliver of movement in the dimly lit passage beyond. A cluster of figures passed, a knot of energy centered around one man. Dr. Peral Harrington strode forward, commanding attention without effort. His camel-colored coat swayed with each step, a leather case in one hand, a smoldering cigarette holder in the other. His booming voice rang down the corridor, the crisp English vowels curling with arrogance. By Paris, this medallion will be the most talked-about artifact in Europe. Laughter, sharp and self-assured, trailed behind him like a signature. Around him, admirers clung to his every word, sycophants eager for favor or scraps of his attention. Agatha lingered in the shadows, her expression carefully blank. She had studied his work, noted the inconsistencies buried under layers of charm and grandiloquence. Brilliant, yes. But brilliance, when accompanied by secrecy, was a fragile thing. One misstep, and it all unraveled. The train jerked forward, the platform sliding away into mist. She returned to her seat by the window, fingers tightening slightly over the armrest as the rhythmic clatter of steel on steel filled the air. Around her, whispers ebbed and flowed in multiple languages, English, French, German, yet all with the same name slipping through hushed tones, Harrington. Some murmured with reverence, others with scorn. Words like fraud and paper-thin evidence drifted through the air like cigarette smoke. Agatha merely watched the world blur past the window, letting the steady rocking of the train lull her into quiet contemplation. Secrets had a way of surfacing, especially in places where no one could escape, and when they did, she would be ready. The dining car was a vision of excess, glowing chandeliers, mahogany panels gleaming under golden light, a space designed to make one forget the world outside. The scent of spiced duck, warm bread, and something subtly bitter hung in the air. It was a setting for indulgence, for whispered alliances, for veiled threats wrapped in pleasantries. Agatha stepped inside, choosing a discreet seat at the far end. Her travel-worn attire helped her disappear into the scenery, but her sharp gaze missed nothing. At the heart of the opulent room, Harrington presided over a gathering of admirers, a cigar smoldering lazily between his fingers, a brandy snifter tilting absently in his other hand. His voice carried effortlessly over the clinking of cutlery, a performance as much as a conversation. "This medallion, ladies and gentlemen," he declared with the ease of a man accustomed to reverence, "is not merely a relic, it is proof." A slight pause, intentional, to let curiosity take hold. Then the flourish of a storyteller, proof that history is not always what we believe it to be. Eyes widened, murmurs rose, but Agatha, unnoticed at the edge of the room, merely leaned back, fingers tracing the rim of her untouched teacup. Proof? Perhaps. Or perhaps just another careful illusion, woven to dazzle those who wanted to believe. But illusions had a way of shattering, and when this one did, Agatha intended to be standing at the center of the wreckage. "Gentlemen," Harrington's voice rang out like the stroke of a conductor's baton, halting conversations mid-sentence, drawing every eye toward him. "This," he declared, holding up the gleaming gold medallion between thumb and forefinger, letting candlelight dance along its etched surface, "is history crystallized. It is civilization itself etched in gold." He paused, savoring the moment, his gaze sweeping the room like a man who knew he owned it. Agatha sipped her soup, her expression giving away nothing. Harrington was not a particularly tall man, yet he filled the space with an undeniable presence. Broad shoulders, a square jaw, hair once jet black now silvering at the temples, his confidence was effortless, his charm honed to a razor's edge. He smiled, that easy, practiced curve of the lips that stopped just shy of sincerity. The kind of smile that had doubtless bought him favors, persuaded skeptics, and turned fiction into fact. Around his table, reactions unfolded like a well-rehearsed play. Sir Julian Blake, ever the gentleman scholar, leaned back with a half-smile, swirling his wine as though letting it breathe, his grey eyes glinting with quiet amusement. He would not challenge Harrington, not openly, but the slight tilt of his brow suggested he found the man's performance more entertaining than convincing. Dr. Evelyn Montague, in stark contrast, sat stiff as a dagger, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, knuckles pale against the crisp linen of her napkin. Dark-haired and severe, her eyes burned with a sharp academic disdain. She did not speak, but her silence was weighty, a loaded pistol yet to be fired. And then there was Madame Isabelle Dubois, elegance woven into flesh and silk. She lounged with the grace of a woman accustomed to power, her black gown a whisper of midnight against the flickering chandelier light. A slender cigarette holder dangled between two fingers, a tendril of smoke curling toward the ceiling. She smiled, faint and knowing, as if indulging a child's fantastical tale. Agatha's gaze flicked downward to the delicate gold bracelet at Madame Dubois' wrist. The way her fingers brushed against it now and then, a gesture almost subconscious, almost nervous, a detail, a crack in the veneer. Meanwhile, Harrington built his tale to a crescendo, painting vivid images of lost civilizations, of dust-covered relics emerging from centuries of silence, of an artifact that would change the very narrative of history itself. The passengers listened, caught in the romance of it all, but Agatha, attuned to the subtle shifts in energy, heard the murmurs beneath, the applause. Doubts, quiet yet persistent, threading through the space like a hidden current. Words like unverified and convenient discovery drifted through the din. When Harrington finally raised his glass, his voice rang with triumph. To history, to adventure, to the boundless human spirit. The room responded in kind, glasses clinking in practiced unison, but Agatha watched closely. Sir Julian's fingers lingered a fraction too long on his glass stem, his toast more gesture than conviction. Dr. Montague barely moved, as if raising her glass to an invisible adversary, rather than to Harrington's grand declaration. And Madame Dubois, her smile unreadable, her nod graceful, lifted her glass in acknowledgement, but not necessarily in agreement. Then, as the train cut through the vast darkness of the countryside, the atmosphere shifted. The bright sheen of Harrington's performance began to dull, replaced by something quieter. He had won the moment, but Agatha knew moments were fleeting. She glanced toward Madame Dubois, just in time to catch a movement, slight, deliberate. As the steward passed, she slipped a small folded note into his palm. His expression never wavered, his hands moved with mechanical efficiency, the note disappearing into his pocket as swiftly as it had appeared. A silent transaction, unnoticed by most, but not by her. Agatha set her spoon down, her mind clicking into place like a well-oiled lock. The game had begun. Steady as the rhythmic hum of the train beneath them, the dinner wound down, but the echoes of Harrington's voice still seemed to linger like a ghostly whisper in the air. Agatha leaned back, her expression unreadable, yet beneath the composed exterior, her mind was already working, dissecting each carefully chosen word, each flicker of unease she had glimpsed in the shifting glances and half-suppressed smirks of those gathered. Secrets, she thought, were like shadows, always present, always lurking, waiting for the right light to bring them into focus. The night passed, and morning crept in with a pale, sickly glow, its light diffused through the thick fog that clung to the landscape beyond the train's windows. The Orient Line Express glided forward, its steady rhythm almost hypnotic. Agatha, ever the early riser, sat in her compartment, fingers curled around a delicate porcelain teacup, steam curling lazily from its surface. The silence was near absolute, save for the distant muffled movements of the train crew preparing for the day ahead. Then, without warning, the tranquility shattered. A shriek, high-pitched roar, a sound ripped from the throat of someone who had just stumbled upon something unspeakable, tore through the corridor. It was not a scream of mere fright. It was a sound laced with horror, the kind that curdles the blood. Agatha set her teacup down with deliberate precision, her fingers steady even as her pulse quickened. A frantic knocking followed, urgent, desperate. When she opened the door, the steward stood there, his usually composed demeanor shattered, his face drained of color. "Madam," he gasped, his breath uneven. "There's been an incident. Dr. Harrington, he's—" The words choked in his throat. Agatha's sharp blue eyes locked onto his, her voice a calming blade through the panic. "Steady yourself," she said, measured and firm. "Now, tell me precisely what has happened." The steward swallowed hard. "Dr. Harrington is dead." In the dining car, Agatha did not hesitate. She retrieved her coat, adjusted her gloves with practiced efficiency, and gestured for him to lead the way. The corridor felt longer than usual, the hushed murmurs of a few early risers adding to the growing tension. As they neared the dining car, a distinct shift in the air settled over them, an eerie stillness, heavy with unspoken dread. The doors swung open. The room, which had been lively and filled with clinking glasses just hours ago, now lay in ghostly silence. The scent of stale wine and untouched food clung to the air. At the head of the grand table, slumped unnaturally in his chair, was Dr. Harrington. His once commanding presence had been reduced to absolute stillness, his head lolled to the side, one arm draped limply over the arm-rest, the other resting mere inches from a shattered wineglass on the floor. Dark red liquid, wine or something more sinister, spread in a slow ominous stain across the polished wood. Agatha stepped forward, her gaze sweeping over the scene with clinical precision. The steward's nervous fidgeting behind her was deafening in the hush. Every plate was still set as it had been the night before, food left uneaten, cutlery aligned with an almost eerie exactness. Whatever had happened had been swift, deliberate. "Close the door," she said evenly. The steward fumbled momentarily, then obeyed. Agatha moved closer, careful not to disturb anything. The expression on Harrington's face struck her, a strange mixture of surprise and something deeper, not just fear, but realization, as though in his final moments, he had seen something he was never meant to see. Her eyes flicked to his slightly rumpled jacket. A fine gold chain peeked from beneath his collar, catching the faint morning light. A detail. A question. Kneeling, she examined the broken wineglass, noting a single drop of liquid clinging stubbornly to the rim, mocking innocent. But it was never the obvious details that mattered. It was the ones hiding in plain sight. Near his left hand, a crumpled napkin, faint ink smudges barely visible against the pristine white. She did not touch it, but she marked its presence in her mind as significant. The steward shifted uneasily behind her. "Madam," he whispered hesitantly, as though afraid to disturb the dead. "Should we alert the authorities at the next stop?" Agatha exhaled slowly, her mind already working, already piecing together the threads of a puzzle that had only begun to reveal itself. "Not yet," she murmured, because something told her that Dr. Harrington's death was merely the first move in a game far more intricate than it seemed. And the killer, they were still on this train. The door creaked open before Agatha could respond, and the conductor stepped inside. A tall man with a stiff posture, his uniform was pristine, yet his carefully maintained composure wavered the moment his eyes landed on the grim tableau before him. His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard, hesitation flickering in his gaze. He was a man accustomed to order, to schedules running with clockwork precision. Death had no place in his world of neatly punched tickets and regimented timetables. "Madam," he began, instinctively addressing Agatha as though recognizing her unspoken authority, "this is most unusual. I'm not sure how to proceed." Agatha, poised and unshaken, straightened, her gaze keen and unwavering, met his with quiet command. "Dr. Harrington has met an untimely end, that much is beyond question," she said, her voice smooth as silk yet edged with steel. "But the nature of his demise and the forces at play require a measured, careful investigation." She let the words settle, then added, her tone firm but not unkind, "If I may, I have some experience in these matters. With your permission, I'd like to conduct an inquiry while the train continues its journey." The conductor hesitated, glancing towards the steward, who gave a nervous but eager nod. There was no handbook for a situation like this. After a moment's consideration, the conductor exhaled sharply. "Very well," he relented. "We must keep this contained until we reach the next station. I trust you'll handle it with discretion. You have my word," Agatha replied, her voice carrying the weight of unshakable resolve. The conductor gave a curt nod before stepping out, closing the door behind him, leaving Agatha alone with the dead man and the secrets that now swirled unseen in the heavy air. She turned back to the scene. The dining car, which only hours before had been alive with warmth, laughter, and the rich aroma of fine cuisine, was now a silent crypt. The elegance of its polished mahogany, the gleam of its crystal chandeliers, all seemed to mock the grim finality of the lifeless figure slumped at the head of the table. Dr. Harrington, who had once commanded attention with his booming voice and imperious gestures, now sat in eerie stillness, his presence reduced to something cold, hollow. The heavy morning light, filtering through the frosted windows, cast a ghostly pallor over the room, making every shadow stretch longer, darker. Agatha remained still, absorbing every detail with the practiced eye of a seasoned observer. A crime scene was not unlike a stage. Every object, every misplaced detail, a potential clue in the silent performance of murder. Her gaze drifted over the table, plates left untouched, silverware meticulously aligned, a tableau of interrupted indulgence. The faint scent of perfume mingled with the acrid sting of spilled wine, and beneath it all, something more elusive, something metallic. Her eyes locked onto the body. Harrington's right hand rested limply on the table, fingers a breath away from a shattered wine glass. Crimson liquid had seeped across the white linen tablecloth in a grotesque bloom. Wine or something more sinister, she could not yet say. His head lolled unnaturally to the side, mouth slightly open as if caught mid-sentence, mid-thought, and around his neck, glinting dully in the pale light, a fine golden chain with a modest pocket watch. A strange accessory for a man who had never once, in all their conversations, checked the time. Her lips pressed into a thin line. That was peculiar. A single drop of liquid clung to the rim of the broken wine glass, delicate, almost mocking. Agatha's gaze traveled lower, to the floor near Harrington's left hand, a crumpled napkin. Faint smudges of ink marred the pristine white fabric. Not accidental, not meaningless. A message, a warning. or something left behind in a desperate moment. She did not touch it. Not yet. Her mind was already spinning, threading together fragments of an unfinished puzzle. The steward shifted anxiously behind her, his nerves betraying him in the twitch of his fingers. "Madam," he murmured, voice barely above a whisper, "should we inform the authorities at the next stop?" Agatha did not answer immediately. Instead she exhaled slowly, her mind already racing ahead, already anticipating the next move in a game that had only just begun. Finally, she spoke, her voice calm, resolute. "No," she said, eyes never leaving the body. "Not yet." Because something told her this was not just an unfortunate demise, this was an opening act, and the true performance was yet to begin. The faintest scuff marks marred the otherwise pristine carpet, a whisper of movement leading away from Harrington's chair toward the door, subtle yet undeniable. Agatha's gaze sharpened, her mind already chasing the implications, and yet what was conspicuously absent from the scene sent a deeper ripple through her thoughts: the leather-bound case. The very same case Harrington had cradled like a sacred relic the evening before, the one containing his so-called artifact of the century, gone. Her lips parted slightly. "Interesting," she murmured, a quiet note of intrigue threading through her tone. With a fluid motion she straightened, brushing the dust from her gloves, her sharp eyes narrowing. Behind her, the steward lingered in the doorway, shifting his weight anxiously, fingers twitching at his sides as though he were debating whether to speak. Agatha turned to him with sudden precision. "When was the dining car last attended?" The question cut cleanly through the quiet. The steward swallowed hard. "After the late dinner service last night, madam," he stammered. "It was locked as usual, no one was meant to enter until breakfast." And yet, Agatha mused, turning her gaze toward the table, Dr. Harrington clearly returned. Her hand gestured elegantly toward the half-empty glass of wine, the untouched bread roll, a scene of interrupted indulgence. But more telling was the disturbance at the opposite end of the table, a chair pushed back slightly, the plate setting subtly askew. "And it appears he wasn't alone." The steward paled. I don't know how anyone—" "Calm yourself," Agatha said, her voice a gentle but unwavering anchor. "Panic will not help us now." She studied him a moment, ensuring his breathing steadied before pressing on. "Where are the other passengers?" "In the salon car, madam," he answered quickly. "The conductor thought it best to keep them together." "Good." Agatha gave a curt nod. "Ensure this room remains undisturbed, and do not speak of the missing case to anyone." The steward's shoulders sagged with visible relief at receiving clear instructions. He bobbed his head in agreement, and slipped out of the room, leaving Agatha alone with the puzzle she was now piecing together. The salon car was a world apart from the dining car's eerie silence. Here, the air was thick with murmurs, hushed whispers interwoven with sharp gasps and muffled exclamations. Suspicion hung over the room like a dense fog, each passenger seated in plush chairs, their expressions a delicate interplay of fear, feigned indifference, and something deeper, something calculating. Agatha entered unobtrusively, allowing herself a moment of quiet observation before being noticed. It was Sir Julian Blake who spotted her first. Reclining near the window, he exuded the kind of effortless aristocratic ease that made his sharp gaze all the more unnerving. His lips curled into a slow knowing smile, but his eyes remained unreadable. "Ah," he drawled, lifting his glass slightly in acknowledgement. "The historian, I take it you've been deputized." Agatha inclined her head, her expression unreadable. "I have offered to assist in the inquiry." She let the words settle before adding, "And I would greatly appreciate your cooperation, Sir Julian." He took a measured sip of his drink, amusement flickering briefly across his features. "Of course, anything to unravel this dreadful business." Agatha let her gaze drift across the room, quietly cataloguing each presence. Madame Isabelle Dubois sat poised on a chaise longue, her delicate hands folded neatly in her lap, her elegance untouched by the morning's grim revelations. Yet her eyes followed Agatha's every movement with a quiet assessing interest. In stark contrast, Dr. Evelyn Montague was pale and visibly shaken, her hands twisted together in anxious knots as she sat bolt upright in the farthest corner. Near the entrance, the conductor stood stiffly, his discomfort evident in the way his fingers twitched at his side. Agatha turned to him. "Has everyone been accounted for?" "Yes, madam," he replied without hesitation. "All passengers are present." "Very good." Agatha faced the room, her voice carrying the weight of quiet authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, as you are undoubtedly aware, Dr. Harrington was found dead this morning in the dining car under unusual circumstances." A ripple of unease passed through the gathered passengers. "I will be speaking with each of you in turn," she continued, her gaze sweeping the room with careful intent. "But for now I ask for your patience and cooperation." A heavy silence followed, broken only by the soft clink of Sir Julian's glass as he set it down upon the polished side table. His voice was the first to cut through the quiet. "A grim affair indeed," he murmured, his tone light, almost too light. Then a slow tilt of his head, eyes gleaming with something unreadable. "I take it foul play is on the table." Agatha did not answer immediately. Instead she let the question hang, a challenge to the air itself, because deep in her mind, she already knew, the game had begun, and somewhere in this very room, the true performance was just waiting to unfold. "It is far too early to draw conclusions," Agatha replied smoothly, though her gaze swept the room like a net cast upon restless waters. "But Dr. Harrington's missing leather case does complicate matters." She let the words linger, watching, always watching. Madame Dubois's eyes flickered toward the conductor, subtle yet telling. Dr. Montague swallowed, her fingers clenching as she shifted in her seat, pale as a ghost. Sir Julian Blake, ever the enigma, maintained his mask of indifference, yet the slight tightening of his grip on the chair's arm did not escape Agatha's notice. The pressure of guilt, or calculation. "Now," she continued, her voice taking on an undeniable edge of command, "if you would be so kind as to remain here, I will begin speaking with you one by one." She let a pause settle, the room so silent she could almost hear the collective heartbeat of those gathered. Then, quietly but unshakably, she added, "The truth has a way of revealing itself, no matter how carefully it is concealed." With that she turned toward the conductor, the first witness in what was sure to be a web of secrets. There were shadows on this train, layers of deception coiled tightly within its walls, and Agatha Morell intended to unravel every last one. Harrington's compartment was a curious contradiction of refinement and disorder. The deep crimson velvet curtains remained undisturbed, elegant, untouched, yet the rest of the space whispered of chaos. The writing desk was in disarray, its papers scattered as if rifled through in haste. A half-empty bottle of brandy stood precariously on the polished surface, its contents drained in uneven gulps. Across the room, a jacket lay abandoned on the arm of a chair, its fabric crumpled, careless. A man who lived with flair, Agatha noted, but little regard for order. She stepped inside, the lingering scent of sandalwood and aged leather mixing with something else, something faint but present. The air of a struggle perhaps, or merely desperation. Then her eyes settled on the desk, and there it was, the leather-bound case, the one Harrington had carried so triumphantly the night before, his so-called artifact of the century. But now, it sat open, hollow. The plush velvet lining still bore the faint indentation of the golden medallion it once held, yet the treasure itself had vanished. No documents, no notes, just an emptiness that felt intentional. Agatha moved forward, gloved fingers tracing the edges of the case. Near the latch, faint smudges marred the smooth leather. Someone had opened it, and not with steady hands. A rush, a theft, a desperate act. "Gone," she murmured, a whisper swallowed by the rhythmic hum of the train. But where, and why? She turned her attention to the rest of the compartment, her movements methodical, precise. Experience had taught her that even the smallest of details could unlock a puzzle. The desk drawers revealed little: a stack of blank stationery, an ink bottle long dried up, a handful of foreign coins. The wardrobe, cluttered with carelessly folded shirts, yielded no immediate answers. It wasn't until she reached the trunk at the foot of the bed that something caught her attention. Beneath a pile of crumpled clothes, something stiff, something old, a folded sheet of paper, yellowed at the edges, torn unevenly down the middle. She unfolded it carefully, her brow furrowing as she took in the jagged script. "Dr. Harrington, your so-called discovery is nothing but a sham. I will not allow you to continue this deception. The truth will out, and when it does, your name will be ruined for good." No signature, but the intent was clear. This was not just a theft. It was a reckoning, a warning, perhaps even a death sentence. Agatha's pulse quickened. Someone had known, someone had been watching, and now, someone was willing to kill, to keep the truth buried. But who? She folded the letter back with careful deliberation. The truth, she had said, had a way of revealing itself, and she intended to see it through, no matter where it led, or who it condemned. Agatha Morell's fingers tightened around the letter, the inked words heavy with unspoken fury. The paper still carried the faintest traces of ink and tobacco, the scent of a secret long hidden yet violently unearthed. Anger simmered beneath its hurried strokes, mingling with the righteous conviction of someone who believed themselves wronged. But who? She read the note again, her sharp mind sifting through the implications. Dr. Harrington's grand claim, the discovery of the elusive golden medallion, had been met with acclaim, but it seemed now that a claim was built on a lie. The artifact was either a masterful forgery, or had never existed at all. Someone aboard this train had known the truth, and they had not been content to let Harrington's deception go unanswered. Agatha sat on the edge of the bed, the letter between her gloved fingers, her gaze drawn once more to the empty leather case. This was no ordinary theft. This was a statement, a reckoning. Harrington's deception had not only threatened his own reputation, but had made him enemies. An archaeologist with rivals desperate to discredit him. A financier with everything riding on the success of this so-called discovery. A dealer accustomed to dealings in the dark, for whom betrayal carried a far steeper price than mere disgrace. Any one of them might have been desperate enough to strike. And yet, resentment alone rarely led to murder. There was something more, something deeper, something hidden beneath the surface of this elegant train, buried in its corridors like a secret waiting to be unearthed. Folding the letter carefully, Agatha slipped it into her pocket, casting one last glance at the empty case before stepping out into the corridor. The truth, she mused, was like the train itself, always moving forward, always just beyond reach. Unless, of course, you knew exactly where to look. And Agatha Morell intended to find it. The compartments of the Orient Line Express were a picture of refinement, plush upholstery, polished mahogany panels, the soft hum of steady motion through the mountains. But beneath the luxury, there was something else, a tension, a whisper of unease. Agatha had spent years unraveling secrets, and she knew one thing to be certain: no matter how deeply buried, the truth always found a way to rise. Sir Julian Blake's compartment was as impeccable as the man himself. The air carried the lingering scent of pipe tobacco and aged leather, a glass of untouched brandy resting on a small side table. The man in question lounged near the window, the morning light catching the silver at his temples, his expression one of careful indifference. "Ah, Miss Marple," he drawled, his voice smooth as silk, his smile more practiced than sincere. He gestured lazily toward the chair across from him. "I take it you've come to inquire about our unfortunate Dr. Harrington?" "I have," Agatha replied, settling herself with quiet poise, her gloved hands adjusted slightly on her lap, her focus unshakable. "You were close to him, were you not?" Sir Julian let out a soft chuckle. a sound that held the calculated ease of a man accustomed to control. Clothes? Hardly. I funded his expeditions, yes. But that was a matter of business, not sentiment. Harrington was, he hesitated, as though selecting his words with care, a man who knew how to weave a compelling tale, and for what it's worth, he had a talent for persuasion, and for stretching the truth. Agatha's voice was mild, yet the sharpness of her gaze did not waver. For the briefest of moments something flickered across Sir Julian's composed features. Annoyance, swiftly concealed beneath his usual mask of affability. Harrington was ambitious, he admitted, exhaling slowly, a man driven by the promise of legacy. As for the medallion, authentic or not, I had no reason to doubt him. Agatha tilted her head, watching him carefully. And yet, she mused, there are whispers that the medallion was a forgery. Sir Julian's smile tightened. Whispers indeed, he murmured, reaching for his untouched glass of brandy, but not drinking. But in my experience, Miss Marple, whispers have a habit of turning into storms. Agatha studied him, the weight of his words settling between them like an unsolved riddle. There was more to this than he was saying, more to this than any of them were saying, and she intended to uncover every last thread. Agatha Marple watched Sir Julian Blake carefully, noting the slight tension in his jaw, the flicker of irritation in his otherwise polished demeanor. Whispers are just that, Miss Marple, gossip without substance, he said smoothly, his voice as even as the polished veneer of his reputation. If you're suggesting that I had anything to do with Harrington's untimely demise, I assure you I had far more to gain from his success than his failure. He lifted his glass of brandy, swirling it absently, but Agatha caught the telltale tremor in his fingers before he took a measured sip. She leaned forward, her voice soft but deliberate. Sometimes, Sir Julian, people act not out of logic, but out of fear. Was there something Harrington knew that you didn't want revealed? His expression didn't change immediately, but the silence that followed was telling. A long breath, a flicker of something in his eyes, then finally he exhaled, setting the glass down with deliberate care. Fear is a powerful thing, Miss Marple, he admitted, but I am not a man who acts on fear. His voice was steady, but Agatha had already seen the crack in his composure. She let the moment hang, then rose. Thank you, Sir Julian, that will be all for now. Doctor. Evelyn Montague's compartment was a stark contrast to Sir Julian's, where his had been steeped in wealth and indulgence. Hers was meticulous, almost clinical in its precision. Books and papers were stacked neatly on the small desk, and her suitcase, though open, was carefully arranged as if she had anticipated an abrupt departure. The woman herself stood stiffly as Agatha entered, her expression guarded. Miss Marple, she greeted curtly, folding her arms across her chest. I presume you wish to speak about Harrington. Agatha nodded, taking the seat across from her. You knew him well, I believe. Evelyn's lips pressed into a thin, firm line. Well enough to know what kind of man he was. Agatha studied her. A brilliant man, some would say. Evelyn's response was immediate, sharp. A thief, and a fraud. Agatha arched an eyebrow. Strong words, Dr. Montague. They're accurate. Evelyn shot back, her jaw tightening. Harrington was a master of taking credit for the work of others. I spent years researching the very sites he claimed as his own discoveries. When I confronted him, he laughed, said no one cared who did the work, only who told the story. There was a tightness in her voice, a bitterness just beneath the surface. You must have been angry, Agatha observed. Evelyn's breath hitched slightly before she composed herself. Angry, she echoed, then exhaled, shaking her head. Yes, I was angry. But I'm a scientist, Miss Marple, not a murderer. I intended to expose Harrington at the next conference. I wanted the truth to ruin him, not this. Agatha regarded her for a long moment. The truth can be a powerful weapon, Dr. Montague, she said finally. But so can silence. Were you aware that Harrington's medallion may have been a forgery? Evelyn hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. "I suspected it," she admitted at last. "But I had no proof." Agatha rose. "And yet," she murmured, "you had plenty of motive, even if you chose not to act on it." "Thank you, Dr. Montague. You've been very helpful." Madame Isabelle Dubois' compartment was a study in elegance. Draped in a silk shawl and seated gracefully at a small table, she exuded effortless sophistication. A porcelain teacup rested before her, its delicate rim untouched, and the faintest trace of floral perfume lingered in the air. As Agatha entered, Madame Dubois offered a slow, knowing smile. "Miss Marple," she said smoothly, her French accent lilting. "What an unexpected pleasure." Agatha inclined her head slightly. "Madame Dubois," she returned, "I appreciate you speaking with me." "But of course," Dubois said, gesturing for her to sit. "We must all do what we can to assist in such unfortunate matters. You were acquainted with Dr. Harrington, were you not?" Madame Dubois picked up her cup, turning it slowly between her fingers before setting it down again. "Acquainted, yes," she admitted. "I admired his passion for history. It is a rare thing, a man so devoted to his work, or to his deception." Agatha countered lightly. Dubois' lips curved slightly, though whether in amusement or something else, Agatha could not say. "Deception," she mused. "Such an interesting word. But tell me, Miss Marple, are we not all guilty of a little deception now and then?" Agatha studied her, feeling the layers of mystery deepen with every passing moment. The train rumbled steadily beneath them, the mountains pressing in as the Orient Line Express barreled forward. A murderer was among them, and the truth, slippery and elusive, was just within reach. The rhythmic clatter of the train wheels against the tracks was a steady undercurrent to the storm of thoughts raging in Agatha Morell's mind. She sat poised in the dim glow of a flickering compartment lamp, the scent of aged paper and lingering perfume heavy in the air as she studied the evidence before her. The letter, its edges softened from anxious handling, lay open in her gloved hands, the words etched in a bold, efficient scrawl that spoke of urgency. "To Roland Vasseur, delivery will be made upon arrival in Paris. Payment in full expected. Medallion authentic. Proceed as planned. Departure from public life imminent." The implications sent a ripple of cold realization through her. Roland Vasseur, one of Europe's most elusive black market dealers, a man whose name carried the weight of whispered transactions in dimly lit rooms, where priceless artifacts were exchanged like contraband. Harrington had not only been entangled in a web of deception, but he had been planning to disappear entirely, slipping into the shadows with his ill-gotten gains. But someone had stopped him before he could make his escape. The question was, who? Her thoughts snapped back to the passengers she had questioned. Sir Julian Blake, the ever-composed but subtly rattled aristocrat, had spoken of profit over fear, but his trembling fingers betrayed something more than casual interest. Dr. Evelyn Montague, sharp as a scalpel, harbored years of resentment against Harrington, a fire of injustice burning behind her carefully measured words. Madame Isabelle Dubois, cloaked in grace and mystery, had remained poised, but the slight tightening of her fingers around that delicate porcelain teacup had not gone unnoticed. And then there was the perfume, the same lingering scent found on the napkin near the dining car, a trace of presence in a place where none should have been. Perfume tends to linger, she had said, but secrets lingered even longer. Agatha's fingers brushed over the letter one last time before she folded it neatly and slipped it into the hidden pocket of her coat. Outside the compartment window, the landscape blurred into a streak of moonlit forests and distant villages, indifferent to the intrigue unfolding within the confines of the luxurious train. Somewhere along this very corridor, the killer moved, their hands perhaps still bearing the stain of their crime, their mind crafting careful alibis. Every piece of evidence, every glance, every word exchanged in hushed tones, each was a thread in a tapestry of deceit. But Agatha Morell had unraveled many such tapestries before, and she would do so again. The truth was always waiting, buried beneath layers of deception, and she was prepared to dig until she unearthed it all. The rhythmic hum of the train pulsed through the corridors, a steady heartbeat against the thickening tension that had settled over its passengers like a shroud. Outside, the Alpine peaks stood shrouded in mist, their towering presence adding to the eerie quiet that had taken hold of the luxury carriage. Agatha Morell walked with unhurried steps, but her mind was racing, weaving together every whispered conversation, every nervous glance, every small but significant moment that had unraveled in the wake of Dr. Harrington's mysterious demise. There was something more to this, something lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to be unearthed. She had been playing this game for too long not to recognize the scent of deception in the air. As she neared the observation car, her sharp gaze caught sight of a young steward standing stiffly by the far window. His hands trembled slightly as they clutched a small envelope, his entire posture radiating unease. He was out of place, too restless, too wary of being noticed. Agatha approached with the air of casual conversation, but her words were deliberate. "You seem troubled," she observed, her voice lilting with the soft touch of concern. The steward's reaction was immediate, too immediate. His hand jerked slightly as he tucked the envelope into the inside pocket of his jacket, his Adam's apple bobbing as he forced a smile. "No, madam, everything is quite in order," he said, but the lie was paper-thin. His darting gaze betrayed him, and Agatha had long since learned that the eyes told more truth than the tongue. She followed his line of sight and found its destination, Madame Isabelle Dubois, seated elegantly near the observation window, speaking in low tones with Sir Julian Blake. Her movements were graceful, deliberate, but there was something else there too, urgency, perhaps even desperation, masked beneath her refined demeanor. Agatha held the moment in her mind like a puzzle piece, carefully filing it away. "Curious," she murmured under her breath before stepping back. The steward had secrets, and so did Madame Dubois. The question was, how deeply were those secrets tied to Harrington's death? Later that afternoon, Agatha found the same steward standing alone in the dimly lit corridor, near the luggage car. He was paler now, his fingers gripping the hem of his uniform in a nervous twist. The weak glow of the train's overhead lamps cast long trembling shadows against the polished wooden walls, and the air in the narrow passageway felt thick with unspoken words. This time, she did not let him slip away. "Steady yourself," she said gently, her voice calm yet commanding. "I am not here to reprimand you, but you know something about Dr. Harrington's death, don't you?" The steward hesitated, his breath quickening. "I don't know anything, madam," he whispered, but the slight quiver in his voice betrayed him. Agatha's gaze did not waver, not even about the package you delivered to him last night. His reaction was subtle but telling, a sharp intake of breath, a shift in weight, the way his hands clenched tighter at his sides. He had not expected her to know. "I was told not to speak of it," he admitted at last, his voice barely above a whisper. "By whom?" The silence stretched thick and heavy, and then finally, "Madame Dubois," he murmured, swallowing hard. "She gave me the package and said it was of great importance. She insisted it be given to Dr. Harrington personally, late that night. She made it clear that no one else was to know." Agatha's mind clicked the pieces into place like a lock turning. A package, given in secrecy, just hours before Harrington's death. It was damning, but it also raised more questions than answers. What had been inside, and why had Dubois taken such great pains to ensure its delivery? "You've been very helpful," Agatha said softly, her tone reassuring. "But I suggest you keep this conversation between us." The steward nodded rapidly before vanishing into the labyrinthine corridors of the train, his footsteps quick, as if trying to outrun the weight of his own conscience. Agatha turned, intending to retreat to her compartment and think, but then, there it was. The faintest sound, a whisper of movement. A door creaking shut just beyond her sight. Someone had been watching her. A slow, controlled exhale left her lips as realization settled in. This was no longer a simple investigation into a man's untimely death. It was something far greater. Someone aboard this train wasn't merely covering their tracks, they were ensuring that no one followed them. And as Agatha took a step forward, her pulse steady, her thoughts sharper than ever, she knew one thing beyond a doubt: the next move would not be hers. It would be theirs. The train rattled on, its rhythmic clatter a stark contrast to the suffocating tension in the dimly lit corridor. The steward's breath hitched, his fingers clutching the fabric of his uniform as though it were the only thing anchoring him to reality. His gaze flickered wildly before settling on Agatha Marple, her unyielding stare piercing through the frantic facade he had woven around himself. "I did it," he choked out, voice hoarse with the weight of his confession. "I killed Dr. Harrington." Agatha tilted her head ever so slightly, her expression betraying neither shock nor judgment. "Go on," she murmured, her voice a calculated blend of reassurance and command. It was the voice of someone who had untangled countless lies before, who could smell deceit like a wolf scents blood. The steward swallowed hard, his lips trembling as he forced out the words. "It was the smuggling," he confessed, his voice teetering on the edge of desperation. "Harrington, he blackmailed me. He forced me to hide artifacts in the luggage compartments, threatened to expose me if I refused. I had no choice. But last night," his breath shuddered, "he told me it wasn't over, that if I didn't help him again, he'd ruin me." His eyes darted toward the shadows as if expecting Harrington's ghost to emerge from the dark. "I couldn't take it anymore. I snapped. I poisoned his wine." The words hung heavy in the air, but Agatha did not move. She observed him, dissecting his confession as if it were a puzzle laid out before her. "A compelling account," she finally said, her voice as smooth as polished glass. "But there are inconsistencies." The steward flinched, his hands tightening into fists. "Inconsistencies," he echoed, barely a whisper. Agatha's lips curved slightly, though there was no warmth in the gesture. "For one, you claim Harrington was alone in the dining car when you entered. Yet the evidence suggests otherwise. There were 2 glasses on the table. Someone else was with him, someone you conveniently forgot to mention." The steward's face drained of color, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. And then Agatha continued, her voice like a knife pressing against his fragile composure. "There's the matter of time. The porter distinctly remembers seeing you in the staff quarters at the very moment you claim to have been in the dining car. You couldn't have poisoned his wine, at least, not alone." His knees buckled slightly, he looked as though he might faint. Agatha stepped closer, her tone softening, though her eyes remained razor-sharp. "I don't believe you killed him," she said gently, "but I do believe someone convinced you to say you did. Someone who knew your past, someone who had the power to make you take the fall." Tears welled in his eyes, his composure crumbling. "They threatened my family," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the hum of the train. "They said if I didn't confess they'd ruin us all." "Who?" Agatha pressed, her voice steady but insistent. "Who forced you?" The steward hesitated, the last strands of his resistance unraveling. He leaned in, his breath ragged. "It was a passenger," he admitted at last. "The quiet one, the one no one notices." Back in her compartment, Agatha sat by the window, the landscape rushing past in a blur of darkness and mist. The pieces of the puzzle arranged themselves in her mind, each clue falling into place. The missing medallion, the coded telegram, the package from Madame Dubois, and now a forced confession. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the telegram she had retrieved from Harrington's cabin. It was the key to everything. He hadn't been smuggling mere trinkets, he had been blackmailing someone. A dangerous game, one he had underestimated. The coded message spoke not of stolen artifacts, but of something far more damning. Documents, evidence, proof of a high-ranking politician's involvement in illegal antiquities trafficking. Harrington had thought he could control the game, that he could wield his knowledge like a weapon. But someone aboard this train had proven him fatally wrong. And now the real killer was still out there, hidden among the unsuspecting passengers, watching, waiting. Agatha exhaled slowly, her gaze shifting to the corridor beyond her door. The train rumbled on, but the danger was far from over. If anything, the real game had only just begun. The storm raged outside, wind shrieking against the windows as lightning carved jagged scars across the night. Agatha Morrell sat motionless in her compartment, fingers steepled, her mind weaving through the tangled strands of deception. Somewhere on this train, the killer was watching, waiting, perhaps even preparing to strike again. The steward's coerced confession had been a diversion, a desperate attempt to protect something or someone far more dangerous. Her thoughts turned to the passengers, filtering through every nervous glance, every fidgeting hand, every half-spoken excuse. And then, like a figure emerging from dense fog, a single name surfaced. The courier, the quiet one. The one who had lingered at the edges of conversations, his gaze constantly shifting, fingers forever hovering over the satchel he never let out of his sight. Agatha's jaw tightened. He wasn't just carrying documents, he was carrying secrets worth killing for. Rising with deliberate grace, she smoothed her coat and stepped into the corridor, the train's steady rhythm a heartbeat beneath her feet. She found him in the observation car, alone, his face bathed in the pale glow of the storm-lit night. "Good evening," she said lightly, but her eyes were unyielding. The courier startled, his hand twitching toward the satchel, his pulse visible at his throat. "Madam," he stammered, "a pleasure to see you." Agatha seated herself across from him, giving him no chance to refuse. "It must be quite a burden," she mused, her gaze flickering to the leather bag, carrying something so valuable. The courier stiffened, his grip tightening on the strap. "I don't know what you mean," he whispered. Agatha's smile was almost kind. "Oh, but I think you do," she murmured. "Dr. Harrington knew, didn't he? He discovered what was inside that satchel, and he tried to use it against you, but you couldn't let that happen, could you?" The courier's face went pale, his fingers trembling. "You're mistaken," he croaked, but there was no conviction in his voice. Agatha tilted her head slightly, her words threading through his defenses like a knife slipping between ribs. "You poisoned his wine, you framed the steward, you thought you had tied off every loose end, but you forgot something." His breath hitched. "What?" he rasped. Agatha leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "Me." The courier bolted to his feet, but before he could move, the doors behind him swung open. The conductor stepped inside, two uniformed officers at his side. "Mr. Jameson," Agatha said smoothly, "I would advise against running. This train has very few exits." The man trembled, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Then his shoulders slumped, and he sank back into his seat, his head in his hands. "I didn't have a choice," he whispered. "They would have killed me." Agatha studied him for a long moment. "Perhaps," she allowed, "but you made your choice, and now, justice will follow." As the train pulled into the next station, Jameson was escorted away, his satchel confiscated. Inside, neatly folded and meticulously sealed, were documents that could set the world ablaze, evidence of a vast conspiracy stretching into the highest ranks of power. Agatha watched from the platform, rain lashing against her coat. The murder had been solved, but something far more sinister lurked beneath the surface. There would be more questions, more mysteries, more battles in the shadows, and Agatha Morrell intended to uncover every single one. The storm outside had begun to wane, but inside the grand salon car of the Orient Line Express, the tension remained thick, a suffocating veil draped over the gathered passengers. Agatha Morrell stood at the center of it all, her poised figure a stark contrast to the dark undercurrents running beneath the surface. Her eyes, sharp and knowing, swept over the uneasy faces before her. "Dr. Harrington," she began, her voice slicing through the charged silence, was not a man of honor, nor was he the esteemed archaeologist he claimed to be. His discovery of the so-called golden medallion was nothing more than a fabrication, a lie woven to secure his fame and fortune. But his deceit did not end there. A murmur rippled through the room. Agatha continued, pacing slowly, punctuating each word with precise deliberation. Harrington was deeply entangled in dealings with the black market, using his expeditions as a cover to smuggle artifacts, priceless relics stolen from civilizations long buried. His ambition knew no bounds, but neither did his arrogance, and that, ladies and gentlemen, was his undoing. A sharp crack of thunder echoed through the night, as Agatha turned her attention to the passengers, her gaze lingering on each of them. Madame Dubois, whose gloved fingers had tightened ever so slightly on the armrest. Sir Julian Blake, who exhaled a slow, measured breath, his expression unreadable. Dr. Evelyn Monroe, whose keen eyes gleamed with something that resembled satisfaction. Agatha pressed on, but it was not the medallion that sealed his fate. No, it was something far more dangerous. Documents, evidence of illicit dealings, records of a high-ranking politician's involvement in illegal antiquities trafficking. A man of Harrington's nature saw it as leverage, an opportunity to bargain his way to greater power. But he underestimated the forces he was toying with. Someone was watching, someone who could not afford for those documents to see the light of day. And so Dr. Harrington was silenced before he could strike his deal. A tremor of unease ran through the assembled passengers. Agatha allowed the silence to stretch, the weight of her words settling like a shroud over them all. Then her voice dropped to a softer, deadlier tone, and the steward, she turned towards the young man standing near the doorway, his face pale, his hands clenched at his sides. He did not kill Harrington, he was forced to say he did. Coerced by someone far more dangerous, a courier, a messenger hidden in plain sight, working under the guise of an ordinary traveler. This courier knew what Harrington possessed, he knew the risk of exposure, and he acted swiftly and mercilessly, slipping the poison into Harrington's wine before ensuring the blame would fall elsewhere. A collective breath was held as all eyes turned to the man now flanked by two stewards. The courier sat motionless, his shoulders hunched, his face ashen with resignation. Agatha faced him directly. "You planned it well," she said, her tone almost gentle, "but you made one mistake. You underestimated me." The man's fingers twitched, his lips parted as though to deny it, but no words came. His silence was the only confession necessary. Agatha straightened, shifting her focus back to the room. "The documents are now secured," she declared, "and they will be handed over to the authorities. Justice will be served, not only for Dr. Harrington's murder, but for the corruption he sought to expose." A heavy silence followed, broken only when Sir Julian let out a dry chuckle, lifting his glass in a mock toast. "Well, Miss Marple," he said, amusement laced with something deeper, something wary, "you have a rather remarkable talent for uncovering the inconvenient truth. I dare say we should all be grateful you were aboard this train." Agatha allowed herself a small, knowing smile. "The truth, Sir Julian," she murmured, "always finds a way. It simply requires someone willing to see it." As the train pulled into the final station, the rain easing into a quiet drizzle, Agatha Marple stepped off onto the platform. The weight of one mystery lifted even as another took shape in her mind. Because the true danger, she knew, was never just the crime, it was the secrets left waiting to be unearthed. The train eased into the station, its gleaming carriages reflecting the dim morning light, a stark contrast to the storm that had raged the night before. The passengers, their nerves frayed by the events of the journey, moved with a subdued air, their voices hushed as they gathered their belongings. Agatha Marple sat in her compartment, her gloved hands resting lightly on her lap, her suitcase packed with the same meticulous precision she applied to her deductions. Through the rain-streaked window, she watched the platform come alive, porters moving with practiced efficiency, loved ones craning their necks for familiar faces, and uniformed officers waiting with an air of quiet authority, ready to take custody of the man who had tried so desperately to outrun justice. But Agatha's thoughts were elsewhere. drifting over the intricate web of deception she had unraveled. The betrayer's trembling hands, the whispered denials, the carefully constructed facade of civility that had crumbled under the weight of truth. Madame Dubois, elegant yet unriddable, her secrets buried beneath a practiced smile. Sir Julian, his charm barely concealing a keen and ruthless mind. Dr. Monroe, whose fury had simmered just beneath the surface, restrained but never extinguished. Each of them had played their part in the intricate drama of murder and motive, their hidden truths momentarily exposed in the glare of revelation before retreating once more into shadow. For a brief moment, Agatha allowed herself to exhale, a fleeting sigh of something that was not quite relief, not quite regret. The train, for all its luxury, the crystal chandeliers, the polished mahogany, the soft velvet seats, had been nothing more than another stage, another backdrop against which the oldest human sins had played out. Greed, deception, betrayal, death. But justice, she reminded herself, had been served, and that in the end was what mattered. A light knock at the door pulled her from her reverie. The conductor, his expression respectful but tinged with curiosity, informed her that the platform was ready for disembarkation. With a graceful nod, she rose, adjusting the tilt of her hat before stepping into the corridor. The air outside was crisp, tinged with the scent of damp earth and coal smoke. As she descended onto the platform, she felt the weight of eyes upon her, passengers who had witnessed her brilliance, who had seen her unravel the truth with the precision of a master weaver. Some nodded in silent acknowledgement, others averted their gaze, unsettled by how easily she had laid their secrets bare. But Agatha did not linger. The mystery had been solved, the murderer unmasked, and now the world moved forward. Behind her, the Orient Line Express stood still, its corridors now empty, its echoes fading into memory. She walked forward, her steps light yet purposeful, merging into the bustling crowd, a quiet force of intelligence and determination. Somewhere, another mystery awaited, another deception to untangle, another hidden truth demanding to be unearthed. And Agatha Marple, with her unyielding mind and unwavering resolve, was ready to face it,